Here is a brown ink by Vinta Heritage Brown Pamana.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A gorgeous brown that has slight tone variation, but only a very slight. And if you aren't looking at it side by side, you won't even really notice it. Except for, of course, an extreme difference in a pen flow or nib width. It shades really well, and very often in the shading dark areas to an almost black. The slight red undertone that you'd be able to see in the swatch doesn't show in the writing, so there's nothing to worry about with that for people like me that don't tend to care for that in their browns. Seeing how beautiful this is on the page leaves me wondering why more people don't have some bottle of brown in their arsenal of ink. This one would be great for that as a dive into brown inks.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M205. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice lighter brown. It comes with no feathering and no spread. The shading that goes on is very, very nice. Look at bottom on the second line, starting darker, but the top of the B is light. The first T is light, very dark at the tom part. And sliding into this next example on line 3 is the word slid, where the S is lighter. The L at the bottom is dark, but top is light. Stays dark through the rest of the word, except the bottom hoop of the D. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is a gentle slope of the lighter and darker tones as seen in the word slope that I accidentally crossed the L as if it was a T on the second line. Starts as a nice midtone, very dark in the T, back to a midtone on the O, very dark on the downstroke of the P, but lighter on the loop of the P with a very dark E, the type of shading that I really do enjoy seeing when it shifts back and forth so frequently. Looking at the medium nib, it is slightly darker than it was with the wet fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading in lower branches of the areas. Looking at lower branches on the second line, the L at the top is a bit lighter. Strange, because I kind of double over that, and yet it was lighter there. It gets darker at the bottom. The W is quite a bit lighter, darkens up at the R, where branches starts light on the B, gets dark on the B, light again on its way out of the B into ranches, which is generally a nice mid-tone, and darkens up at the his at the end, H-E-S, right there, where some has no shading, not even some. Looking at the broad nib, it is slightly lighter than what we got with the medium nib. Almost, a match for what we see with the soft fine in terms of how dark this tone is. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We get an onslaught of shading as seen in the word onslaught on the first line. Look at the first part. The O is lighter and the N is darker. Nice mid-tone on the S-L-A-U, and starts to darken up at the G-H, very dark at the T, and soon you'll be able to see great shading happening with the word soon on the second line, starting lighter, dark at the bottom of the S, nice mid-tone and dark tone on both O's, dark on the left, mid on the right, stays mid-tone through the N. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker, I think, than what we had on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. It does shade not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but certainly is giving nice crashes of shading throughout. Looking at the word crashes, that starts lighter, gets a little bit darker, still in the midtones, darkens up even more on the A, lightens up into those midtones in the S, darkening again at the HE, light tone at the S. Heard is largely a dark word until you get to the A. It lightens up just a little bit. The second part of the R, quite a bit darker, lighter on the D. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shade here is not broken, it's definitely there. Look at broken on the second line, where it starts darker, lightens up at the bottom of the B, stays lighter as a tone, darkens up at the K again, but then lightens its way out of it. Really, it's doing such a nice job. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib, a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get a bit of shading. Looking at the word bit on the first line, the top of the B is a bit darker, but the rest is lighter. It stays a little lighter, but very dark at the T. It's almost like magic. Looking at Gandalf, that starts darker, but lightens at the top of the G. Darkens at the top of the G, lightens down at the loop, stays in that nice lightened mid-tone through most of the word, and then gets very light at the L, back to the mid-tone on the F, darker at the bottom of the F. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium, little lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some areas of shading. They just kind of come in quickly, like the word quickly on the second line, where you see the dot of the I and the K are much darker than the rest of the word, and the LY, that was a pressure of my hand, that wasn't the pen skipping or a cause of the ink. The LY is a little bit darker than the beginning of that same word, quickly. Now, grumbled on the second line is mostly a nice mid-tone with darker mid-tones at the BLE and then lightening up at the end of the D. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, the first thing I notice is that it stays a brown. I was really expecting this to kind of bring out some of those red tones that this looks like it would be able to have, yet it doesn't. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading, not little shading, not dwarf size shading. Look at dwarves on the third line. Starting darker, works its way light through most of the word, darkens up at the S again. Even the and Bilbo, that first parenthesis is dark, where and is a nice midtone, and Bilbo has dark and midtones to it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get nothing for shading here. The paper has eaten it up, and this paper does tend to have a little bit of an effect on an ink and its performance. And here we're seeing it. While there's no shading, we are getting a very nice brown the whole way. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading. I say almost because there's only one or two darker spots I can spot. The up and down of slide on the first line, or the T of must on the first line, the T of light directly underneath it. But for the most part, we're getting a fairly uniform brown that does look nice on the page. It's just absent of the shading that we know it can do. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Tad bit lighter, just a little bit lighter than what we had on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. We get some of the shading back, deepening on the first line. If you look, the D and the first E are a little bit darker. That second E lightens up where the P gets dark. It lightens into that midtone again until you get to the G where it darkens up just a little bit. Far from having no shading with far directly underneath it, you see that that starts as a nice darker midtone, and the R itself gets a bit darker. Not as standout as through right before it, where the H is quite a bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, and the ghosting, we could easily write back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading, but not as pronounced as it was on the Clairfontaine. It's really limping through that. Taking a look at limped on the third line, the top of the L is a bit darker, where the bottom and IM is also dark. The beginning of the P stays dark, and then it lightens up into the PED until the top of the D, where it gets dark again. There is some shading, like fast on the fourth line, starts dark, gets lightened on the as, and then dark again on the T. So it does shade, just not as stand out. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get a nice forest of shading, looking at forest on the second line, that starts very dark at the top of the F, really lightens up into the bottom of it, and for that part stays rather light until it gets to the S. The E gets quite a bit darker, and then it goes for a nice midtone on the S, dark at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is only slightly darker than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. we get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading, not as standout as it was on the Clairefontaine, but it does find its way to get through, like on through on the first line. The T is lighter than the HR, and the OU lighter again till it gets to the GH where it gets dark. With directly underneath it starts as a nice mid-tone, gets very dark at the T, lightens up just a shade on the top of the H. So the shading here is nice, definitely not as standout as it was with the Clairefontaine. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading. Just a quiet amount. It's not yelling, look at the shading the way it did on the Clairefontaine. Just a quiet amount, looking at quiet. On the first line, you see the left side of the bottom hoop is darker than the rest of the Q. It stays lighter till the second part of the U, I, lightens up a little bit with the E and very dark at the T. Really can floor you, like floor on the line directly beneath it. The F's is lighter in coming into it, dark at the top, mid coming down, dark at the very bottom of the F, lightening up as it comes up again. And on the L, it's a nice mid-tone, except the bottom of the L, where the rest of the word stays a nice mid-tone.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is 3 oysters, mustard.
Here is diamine burnt sienna. Here is Krishna ochre. Here is Noodler's number 41. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, not flatter as a tone, really just lighter in its darkness and barely. No feather, no spread, shades not as well as it does on the Clairefontaine, but certainly does bring in a nice touch of it. Looking at forced silence on the first line, you see at the bottom left part of the F, it's darker. The E and the T are darker. Silence, it's the L into the E that is darker in itself, and that is nice. Looking at that directly underneath that word, we see T is a nice mid-tone. The H gets very dark. The A is very light, where the last T very dark, showing off how much it can do even with this non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get only hints of shading wagging out there just a little bit, with wagging on the third line. Starts as a mid-tone, gets a little bit of dark areas in both G's, back into the mid-tone on the in, very dark at the G. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with only the tiniest little spots of shading, much like you bruised just little spots. Look at bruised on the second line. The first part of the B is a little bit darker, goes into a mid-tone until you get to the ED that darkens up just a little bit. ED would be a dark spot to have. Ache. Things can ache, but looking at ache on the third line, mid-tone, darker mid-tone on the he at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tiny bit lighter than it was with the medium, not as light as it was with, or lighter than on the Clairfontaine, not as light as it was with the soft fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading, only a couple of dark spots, just a decent brown here, nothing special. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by
Diamine Pink Glitz.
Here is a green ink by
Krishna Palmleaf. Here is an orange ink by Aurora Orange.
Here is a blue-black ink by
Sailor Silent Night.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. As a tone, I am here starting to see just little bits of those red undertones, but it's only here. So it's just as dark as, or a little bit darker in tone than the Clairfontaine, but just a hint of the red undertones. Only a hint, not anything that spoils it. It does feather, it does spread, it does shade. I think what we have here is not horrible. I think you could use it if you wanted to on this paper. Like many inks, I think you would be losing out by doing that. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit darker, I think, than on the Clairfontaine. Lots of feathering, lots of spread. Nothing to be said for shading. Look at nothing at the first word. The amount of feather, spread, no shade, disgusting. Not all of a sudden, like all of a sudden at the end of the first and beginning of the second line. No, this is a downhill slide the whole way. Looking at the medium nib, it is slightly lighter than it was with the wet fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine, still showing some of that red lean. No feather? No, of course not. No spread? No, of course not. It does feather and it does spread, but not as bad as the wet fine did. I think this is a much more manageable situation to where if this is the paper that you insist on using a medium flow medium is much better than a wet fine. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really does show some of the red undertones much more than the medium did. I just think it's a bit more obvious here because of the thicker lines. The feather and the spread are very manageable for what I'm seeing on the page. Really very minimal. You can live with it if you have to, but why live with sheet paper? Looking at the back of the page, I don't think you could write on the back of the page with the exception of that soft fine. That's a very dry writing pen. That amount of ghosting, you could probably get away with writing on both sides. Now, none of this bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine is a nice lighter brown with nice shading, where the wet fine is a beautiful darker brown with shading that really draws attention. The medium flow medium just slightly darker than the wet fine with the same level of shading. The broad is a tone between the soft fine and the medium, and it shades just as good as any of the other pens. For me, the tone and the shading of the broad with a medium flow was the spot-on perfect combination, and that's why it's my choice, the medium flow broad.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.